While he sipped champagne with his mistress in luxury hotels, his wife was mocked for selling baked goods at farmers markets. Now, years later, as her empire expands and his fortune crumbles, they meet again. But the man who once left her isn't ready for the woman she's become. The ballroom pulsed with the rhythm of laughter, the soft clinking of crystal glasses, and the whisper of designer shoes against marble floors. Everything about the night was excessive, just the way David Harper liked it. The chandelier overhead cast a golden hue on the sea of elite guests, each one reveling in the opulence as if it were their birthright. And maybe for some of them, it was. David adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and surveyed the scene, the satisfaction bubbling within him as he leaned casually against the bar. Success had never felt this tangible. Deals had been closed, rivals crushed, and tonight, it was time to enjoy the spoils. His gaze drifted to the woman draped across his arm, Sophia, his new and younger companion, who sparkled like the diamonds around her neck. She was everything society expected her to be: elegant, enticing, and perfectly content to be seen rather than heard. "Darling," Sophia purred, her fingers lightly grazing his wrist as she held up her half-empty flute of champagne. "More." Her smile was sugary sweet, but David caught the flicker of something beneath it, an expectation that went beyond tonight's festivities. He smirked, flagging down a waiter without a second thought. Of course, only the best. The night was a victory lap, a celebration not just of business milestones, but of personal ones. His divorce had been finalized weeks earlier, freeing him from what he had long considered a burden. Helen had been a good wife, reliable, loyal, and supportive. But good wasn't enough. Not for a man like him, someone always seeking the next thrill, the next conquest. Helen had become predictable, fading into the background of his life like wallpaper you stopped noticing after a while. The day he met Sophia at a charity gala, he had felt something reignite. She was a spark, a reminder that he was still desired, still vibrant. Leaving Helen had been easier than he'd expected. The final meeting at the lawyer's office had been cold, clinical, with only a few polite exchanges before they signed their names on the dotted lines that dissolved their marriage. But Helen's parting words had lingered, despite his efforts to dismiss them. "I hope you know what you're doing, David." At the time, he had laughed. Of course he knew. He was upgrading, moving forward. Helen had been the past, and Sophia was the future. What could possibly go wrong? As he watched Sophia twirl the stem of her glass between her fingers, the amber glow of the room reflecting off her jewelry, he felt the same rush of ego-driven satisfaction that had carried him through their affair. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts, ones he wasn't ready to confront just yet. "David," a voice called from behind him, and he turned to see James, an old friend and business associate, approaching with an air of intrigue. "Quite the party you've thrown. You always know how to make an exit and an entrance." James' laugh was hearty, but there was an edge to it. David chuckled. "Well, you know me. No half measures." "True enough," James said, taking a sip of his drink. "So, what's next for you? A new investment venture? Or just riding the wave with Sophia?" He winked, but David caught the underlying jab. James had been close to Helen once, and though he never said it outright, David knew where his loyalty had remained. "I'm always planning something," David replied smoothly, deflecting the tension with practiced ease. "But tonight, I'm just enjoying the present." James nodded, but didn't look convinced. "Hope you've thought this through." Before David could respond, Sophia looped her arm through his and smiled at James. "If you'll excuse us, we have a dance to attend to." Without waiting for an answer, she led David onto the dance floor, where the music swelled into a crescendo of violins and piano. Sophia swayed effortlessly against him, her body fitting perfectly in rhythm, but David's mind was elsewhere. Helen's face flashed briefly in his memory. Not the worn-down woman from the divorce meeting, but the version of her from when they first met. She had been vibrant back then, full of ambition and warmth. They had built their life together brick by brick, sharing dreams over late-night coffee and fighting battles that once brought them closer instead of driving them apart. He shook the thought away as Sophia leaned into him, whispering something about their weekend plans in Paris. He nodded absent-mindedly, his grip tightening around her waist, as if holding on to her would silence the noise in his head. Meanwhile, across town in a dimly lit apartment, Helen Harper sat on the floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The air smelled of rain from the storm earlier that evening, and the soft glow of a single lamp barely illuminated the room. She cradled a mug of tea in her hands, the steam curling up and warming her face as she listened to the distant hum of traffic. Her new reality was a far cry from the sprawling mansion she had once called home. There were no marble countertops or crystal chandeliers here, just the creak of wooden floors and the faint dripping of a leaky faucet. But it wasn't the loss of luxury that gnawed at her. It was the humiliation, the whispers of neighbors, the pitying looks from friends, and the cruel parting words from David that echoed in her mind. "You'll see how much you needed me." She had needed him once, or so she thought. They had built a life together, raised their son, and created a facade of perfection that had fooled everyone, including her. But the cracks had been there all along, widening with each passing year until the foundation crumbled beneath her. The sound of small footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Ethan, their 10-year-old son, shuffled into the room, his hair tousled from sleep and his pajama pants slightly too long for his growing frame. "Mom?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you still awake?" Helen smiled faintly and patted the spot next to her on the floor. "Just thinking, sweetheart. Couldn't sleep." Ethan sat down and leaned his head against her shoulder. "Are we gonna be okay here?" he asked, his voice small but filled with the kind of vulnerability that only a child could express. She swallowed the lump in her throat and wrapped her arm around him. "Yes, we are. It's different, but we'll be okay. I promise." He nodded, trusting her words even when she wasn't sure she trusted them herself. After tucking him back into bed, Helen returned to the living room and stared out the window at the rain-soaked streets below. Her mind was racing, not with regrets but with possibilities. David thought she would fade into obscurity, but he had underestimated her resilience. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to rebuild, and this time, it would be on her own terms. As the rain pattered against the window, Helen felt the flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: determination. The chapter with David was over, but her story was far from finished. And for the first time since her world fell apart, she allowed herself to believe it. What would you do if you were in Helen's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to follow her inspiring journey. You won't want to miss how things unfold. The morning sunlight filtered through the narrow blinds of Helen Harper's modest apartment, casting striped patterns of warmth across the worn wooden floor. She sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee cradled between her hands. The apartment was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of the floorboards as they adjusted to the shifting temperatures of the morning. It had been months since she and Ethan moved in, yet the space still felt unfamiliar, like a temporary refuge instead of home. The walls, once painted an uninspiring beige, had remained untouched. Half-packed boxes lingered in corners, as though unpacking them would mean accepting that this was her life now, stripped of luxury and the comfort of familiarity. Helen sipped her coffee slowly, the bitterness settling on her tongue. She glanced over at Ethan's school bag, leaning against the door where he had left it after breakfast. He had been trying so hard to be brave, masking his worries behind the brave facade of a 10-year-old boy who didn't want to see his mother sad. But she could feel his fear in the way he clung to her when she tucked him in at night or asked questions like, "What's for dinner tomorrow?" with genuine concern, as if he worried the answer might be nothing. The weight of it all pressed against her chest. Their savings, what little she had left after the divorce settlement, was quickly depleting. David had been ruthless in court, fighting her on every financial aspect of their separation. The house had gone to him, along with the bulk of their shared investments. What she'd walked away with could only sustain them for so long. But she had agreed to the terms, desperate to leave the battlefield and reclaim what little peace she could. She had applied for dozens of jobs, but rejection after rejection had come flooding in. Her time away from the workforce to raise Ethan was seen as a weakness, not a strength. Employers looked at her resume and saw a gap, not the years of multitasking, budgeting, and problem-solving that came with managing a household. They didn't see the late nights she'd spent balancing family budgets, organizing charity events, or managing every intricate detail of David's high-profile social engagements. Helen set her mug down and opened her laptop, the screen glowing with the same job search website she had visited every morning for the past month. She scrolled through listings for administrative assistants, receptionists, and entry-level marketing jobs, none of which seemed like they could offer her a fresh start. After 2 hours of scrolling and sending applications, her inbox began to ding with automated rejection emails. She closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, and closed her eyes. Defeat wasn't something she was used to, but it had made itself at home here, settling into every corner of her life. She could feel its grip tightening, threatening to suffocate what little resolve she had left. The sound of keys jangling at the front door pulled her from her thoughts. The door creaked open, and Ethan appeared, his face flushed from running up the stairs after getting off the school bus. "Mom, I'm home." His voice echoed through the small apartment, filling the silence with a much-needed burst of life. "Hey, sweetheart." Helen managed to smile as she stood and walked over to him. She tousled his hair affectionately before helping him take off his coat. "How was school?" Ethan shrugged, dropping his bag onto the floor. "It was okay. We have a math quiz tomorrow, but I think I'll do fine." She admired his resilience. Even with the upheaval of their lives, Ethan remained grounded, trying his best to adapt. "I'm sure you will," she said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Why don't you wash up, and I'll start dinner?" As Ethan disappeared into the bathroom, Helen returned to the kitchen. She opened the fridge, eyeing its sparse contents with a growing sense of dread. A half-empty carton of eggs, a bag of wilting lettuce, and a small block of cheddar cheese stared back at her. She sighed and pulled out the ingredients, mentally planning how to stretch them into something Ethan would eat. While the omelet sizzled on the stovetop, her phone buzzed on the counter. She hesitated before picking it up, half expecting another rejection email. But when she saw the caller ID, her heart sank. It was her mother. Helen answered hesitantly. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, dear." Her mother's voice was warm but carried a familiar undertone of concern. "I was just checking in. How are you and Ethan holding up?" "We're fine," Helen replied, stirring the eggs in the pan. She kept her voice steady, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. "We're managing," her mother sighed, the kind that conveyed years of wisdom and unspoken understanding. "You know, if you need help, we're fine," Helen cut in, her tone firmer than she intended. "Really?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Helen could almost picture her mother pursing her lips in thought. "Okay, but promise me you'll ask if things get too hard. You don't have to do this alone." "I know. Thanks, Mom." Helen ended the call and placed the phone back on the counter, exhaling slowly. Her mother's concern, though well-meaning, felt like another reminder of her failures, of the fact that she was struggling to provide the stability that once came so easily. By the time Ethan sat down for dinner, the weight of the day had worn her thin. But she smiled through it, listening intently as he described his favorite part of the day, scoring the winning goal during recess soccer. His eyes lit up as he spoke, and for a brief moment, Helen forgot about the unpaid bills and the mounting pressure. Here, at the dinner table, was her anchor, her reason to keep going. After dinner, Helen washed the dishes while Ethan worked on his homework at the kitchen table. The dim glow of the overhead light made the room feel cozier than it was, but Helen welcomed the illusion. As she dried the last plate, she glanced over at her son, who was furiously erasing something on his math worksheet. "Need any help?" she asked, leaning against the counter. Ethan shook his head. "I got it, but thanks." She admired his independence, but it also reminded her of how quickly he was growing up. Soon, he wouldn't need her for math homework, or much else for that matter. The thought stirred something bittersweet in her chest. As the night settled around them, Helen tucked Ethan into bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as she kissed him goodnight. He murmured something in his sleep, his small hand clutching the blanket tightly. Once he was asleep, Helen returned to the living room and sank into the couch. The glow of the TV flickered, casting shadows on the walls. She wasn't watching the screen. Her mind was elsewhere, sifting through memories of the life she had left behind. David had been her partner, her compass, and her constant, until he wasn't. She had trusted him with her dreams, only to watch him trade them for someone younger and more exciting. The humiliation of being replaced still stung, but what hurt more was the lingering doubt that perhaps he had been right. Perhaps she wasn't enough. But as she sat there, staring at the blank walls of her apartment, a thought struck her, a quiet but powerful realization. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control what came next. She wasn't finished yet. Helen stood, her resolve hardening like steel. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had something far more important, the will to fight. And that, she knew, was a start. The hum of the early morning market buzzed with life as Helen parked her old car in the gravel lot just outside the downtown square. A cool breeze brushed against her skin as she stepped out, balancing a crate of neatly packaged muffins and scones against her hip. The scent of freshly baked goods followed her, mingling with the crisp autumn air. Vendors were setting up their stalls, bright canopies flapping in the wind, tables being arranged with local produce, handmade crafts, and artisanal cheeses. This was her first time here as more than a shopper, and her nerves betrayed her steady hands. Helen scanned the bustling area, her breath visible in the morning chill, until she spotted her small designated stall wedged between a vendor selling homemade candles and another offering jars of honey. She let out a shaky breath, relieved to see it wasn't tucked too far in the back where foot traffic dwindled. "Here goes nothing," she murmured, setting the crate down and beginning the setup. The white tablecloth was laid neatly over the folding table, the arrangement of muffins, scones, and small pastry boxes placed with care. Each item had been baked in the dim hours of the morning, while Ethan still slept. She'd worked through the fatigue, her kitchen filled with the smell of melted butter and warm cinnamon. Every batch carried a fragment of her determination. This was more than just baking. It was survival. As she arranged the last of the items, a voice startled her from behind. "First time here?" Helen turned to see a man in his 50s wearing a thick, knitted sweater and a welcoming smile. He leaned on the edge of her table, eyeing the spread of baked goods with an approving nod. His stall, an impressive display of homegrown apples and pears, was directly across from hers. "Yeah, it's my first time," Helen admitted, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I'm a little nervous." "Don't be," the man replied. "The trick is to smile even if you're dying inside. People love a friendly vendor." She laughed, grateful for the kindness. "Thanks for the tip. I'm Helen, by the way." "Tom," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I've been selling here for years. Let me know if you need anything, water, a break, or just someone to chat with when business is slow." "I appreciate that," Helen said, shaking his hand. As he walked back to his stall, she allowed herself to exhale the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The first customers trickled in shortly after the market officially opened. Couples wandered hand in hand, stopping to inspect the produce and crafts. Children tugged on their parents' coats, begging for treats or toys. Helen adjusted her posture, offering a warm smile to anyone who passed by, but her nerves coiled tighter with each minute that went by without a sale. What if no one wanted her baked goods? What if the hours spent preparing had been for nothing? A woman in a beige coat stopped at the table, inspecting the neatly arranged rows of muffins. "What kind of muffins are these?" she asked, pointing to a batch topped with crumble. "Apple cinnamon," Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Made fresh this morning." The woman nodded, her eyes scanning the rest of the table. "And those?" "Blueberry lemon scones. They're a little tart, but sweet enough to balance it out." The woman hesitated before picking up a muffin and a scone, handing Helen a few bills. "I'll give them a try. They smell amazing." Relief flooded Helen's chest as she handed the woman her change. Her first sale. It was small, but it was proof that someone, even a stranger, saw value in what she had created. As the morning progressed, more customers stopped by, each interaction chipping away at her initial doubts. Some bought a single item. Others walked away with boxes of pastries for their families. A mother with twin toddlers thanked her for the complimentary mini muffins she handed out, promising to come back next week. By noon, her table was half empty, and Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not bad for a first-timer. Tom called out during a lull in the crowd. "Looks like you're on your way to becoming a regular." Helen smiled, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Let's hope so. I didn't expect this kind of turnout." "It's because your stuff is good," Tom said simply. "People can tell when something's made with care." His words warmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't just baked to make money. She'd baked because it was one of the few things she had left that made her feel capable. Hearing that it mattered to someone else made the effort worthwhile. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan arrived at the market, having finished his weekend soccer practice. His cheeks were flushed from the cool air, and his smile widened when he saw the nearly empty table. "Wow, Mom, you sold almost everything?" "Almost," Helen said, ruffling his hair. "You want to help me with the last bit?" He eagerly grabbed a basket of pastries and walked around the nearby stalls, handing out samples and directing people back to their booth. Helen watched him with a mix of pride and gratitude. Despite the upheaval of their lives, Ethan had remained her constant supporter. His belief in her never wavered, even when her own faith in herself did. By the time the market began to wind down, Helen had sold nearly all her goods. The few muffins and scones left were packed into a small box to bring home for dinner. As she folded the tablecloth and packed up her supplies, Tom walked over with a bag of apples. "Here," he said, placing the bag in her hands. "Consider it a welcome gift." "Thank you, Tom," she said, genuinely touched. "I'll bring you some pastries next time." Looking forward to it, he tipped his hat and walked back to his truck, leaving Helen to finish packing. On the drive home, Ethan chattered excitedly about his adventures at the market, recounting the customers who had complimented his mother's baking. His energy was contagious, and for the first time in a long while, Helen allowed herself to feel something she had been too scared to embrace: pride. Back in the apartment, the warmth of the oven still lingered from the morning's baking frenzy. Helen placed the leftover pastries on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table, her body aching from the day's work, but her heart lighter than it had been in months. Ethan sat across from her, munching on an apple from Tom's bag. "Do you think we'll go back next week?" he asked between bites. "Definitely," Helen said, leaning back in her chair. Today was just the beginning. As the evening settled around them, Helen opened her laptop and created a new spreadsheet to track expenses, profits, and potential improvements for the next market. The numbers weren't extraordinary, but they were enough to give her a starting point. She wasn't chasing perfection, just progress. A notification popped up in the corner of the screen. A message from Peter, an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. The subject line read, "Saw your post about the market. Call me when you can." Helen's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind flashing back to their last conversation before she married David. Peter had always believed in her ambitions, even when she had abandoned them for marriage. Maybe it was time to reconnect. Closing the laptop, she made a mental note to call him in the morning. Tonight, she would rest, knowing that for the first time in what felt like forever, she had taken a step forward. The rhythmic tapping of David Harper's polished leather shoes echoed through the gleaming marble floor of his company's headquarters. The building, a towering symbol of his success, loomed above the city like a fortress of glass and steel. But the sense of invincibility that once filled David every time he entered its doors had begun to wane. He strode past rows of desks where employees typed furiously, their eyes avoiding his. The tension in the air was palpable, and David knew why. Rumors had been swirling for weeks. Murmurs of plummeting stocks, failed acquisitions, and board members growing restless. He had brushed off the whispers at first, confident that the downturn was temporary, a minor setback for someone of his caliber. But as the problems multiplied, so did the sense that the walls were closing in. David entered the boardroom, where the senior executives sat waiting. The room, once a place where he commanded respect and admiration, now felt cold and sterile. As he took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table, he noticed the sideways glances, the silent judgments passing between the men and women who had once hung on his every word. "Let's get started," David said, his voice firm but lacking the authority it once held. The CFO, an older man named Richard with a graying beard and a sharp gaze, cleared his throat and opened a folder filled with charts and financial reports. "As you know, the company's performance over the last quarter has been less than ideal. David fought the urge to roll his eyes. I'm aware of the numbers, Richard. What I need is a solution. Richard hesitated, exchanging a brief look with the head of marketing. We've explored several options, but the reality is that our liquidity is dangerously low. The board is concerned about the upcoming investor meeting. David leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the polished wood of the table. Then reassure them. Tell them we're restructuring, cutting costs where necessary. We've weathered storms before. This isn't like before, Richard said, his tone measured but pointed. Our competitors have adapted faster, and our core investments are underperforming. The real estate project in the city's financial district was a major loss. David clenched his jaw. That project had been his idea, a supposedly foolproof venture that should have resulted in a windfall. Instead, delays and budget overruns had turned it into a money pit. We'll pivot. Find something new. Another executive, a woman in her mid-40s with a crisp suit and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned forward. David, with all due respect, we need more than optimism. The board is prepared to recommend more drastic measures, selling off assets, cutting staff, possibly bringing in an external consultant. The word stung, but David maintained his composure. I built this company from the ground up. No one knows its potential better than I do. That's exactly why the board is worried, Richard said. You're too close to it. The room fell silent, the weight of their doubt settling over him like a shroud. David forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'll address the board directly. This company isn't failing on my watch. When the meeting adjourned, David returned to his corner office, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view, once a source of inspiration, now felt like a taunt. He loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it wasn't enough to dull the ache gnawing at him. Sophia's voice echoed in his mind, a reminder of the conversation they had the previous night. She had grown increasingly impatient with him, her once charming laughter replaced by sharp remarks about his lack of attention and the dwindling luxuries she had grown accustomed to. This isn't what I signed up for, David, she had said, her tone icy as she examined her reflection in the bedroom mirror. When are things going to get better? He hadn't had an answer for her. Instead, he had stared at the ceiling long after she fell asleep, his thoughts racing. How had it come to this? He had once been the man with all the answers, the one who made things happen. Now, it felt as though he were constantly 2 steps behind, scrambling to catch up. The sound of a knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, a young woman with a polite smile that barely masked her nerves, entered with a folder in hand. Mr. Harper, I have the latest reports on the company's subsidiaries. Also, your meeting with the investors is confirmed for next Friday. Leave the reports, David said, waving her off. I'll review them later. She nodded and left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. David flipped open the folder, scanning the grim figures. Declining profits, underperforming assets, and a series of bad investments stared back at him like accusations. He closed the folder abruptly and drained the rest of his whiskey. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a notification. Local business owner gaining traction with successful expansion. David ignored it, assuming it was another headline about a tech startup or trendy new restaurant. But the name caught his eye. Helen Harper. Sweet Revival Bakery expands into multiple locations. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Helen. He hadn't thought much about her since the divorce, assuming she would fade into the background as he continued to move forward. Yet here she was, making headlines. He opened the article, scanning the details. Her bakery had started as a small stall at farmers markets, but it had quickly grown into a regional sensation. Her story was framed as a tale of resilience, a woman rebuilding her life after a devastating divorce. David stared at the screen, his chest tightening. She had done it without him. The woman he had discarded, the one he had assumed would flounder without his financial support, had found success on her own terms. The article included a photo of Helen standing in front of one of her bakery locations, her smile radiant and genuine. She looked different, stronger, more confident, as if the weight of their past had been lifted from her shoulders. He set the phone down, his mind racing. A mix of emotions surged within him: disbelief, jealousy, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. Regret? Guilt? Whatever it was, it gnawed at him, reminding him that while he was watching his empire crumble, Helen had quietly built her own. The buzz of his intercom broke the silence. "Mr. Harper, you have a call on line 1. It's urgent." David hesitated before pressing the button. "I'll take it." The voice on the other end belonged to one of the company's major investors. "David, we need to talk. The board is pushing for an emergency meeting. They want to discuss leadership changes." David's grip tightened around the phone. "I'm handling it." "They don't think you are," the investor replied bluntly. "You need to present something concrete, or they'll force your hand." As the call ended, David leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. The weight of the crisis was suffocating, but what haunted him even more was the realization that Helen had risen while he was falling. He glanced at the whiskey glass, then back at the article about Helen. For the first time in his life, he felt truly cornered, and he didn't know how to fight his way out. The smell of freshly baked bread and cinnamon pastries filled the air, blending with the sound of customers chatting and the clinking of cups against saucers. Sweet Revival, Helen Harper's bakery, had grown beyond her wildest dreams. What had once been a small stall at the farmer's market now occupied a bright, welcoming storefront on a bustling street corner. The bakery's glass windows displayed rows of artisanal pastries, cakes, and breads that drew in passers-by with the promise of indulgence. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the hum of laughter and the comforting buzz of a well-loved community space. Helen moved behind the counter with practiced ease, taking orders and chatting with customers as she worked. It was her favorite part of the job, connecting with people, hearing their stories, and watching them light up as they took that first bite of something she had created. The sense of purpose it gave her was something she hadn't felt in years. 2 cappuccinos and a slice of the lemon pound cake. "Please," a woman in a navy blazer said, handing over her credit card. "Coming right up," Helen replied, her hands moving swiftly to prepare the order. As she worked, her mind drifted to how far she had come. The first few months of starting the bakery had been grueling. Long nights baking, early mornings at the market, and constant worry over whether she could make ends meet. But step by step, she had built something tangible. Her reputation had grown by word of mouth, and soon, she was receiving catering requests from local events and businesses. She'd saved enough to rent a small commercial kitchen, and from there, the opportunities had multiplied. The bakery had only been open for 6 months, but its impact on the neighborhood was undeniable. Local newspapers had written glowing reviews, praising not only the quality of her baked goods, but also the story behind them. The article about her journey, from a humbling divorce to building her own business, had gone viral, bringing in waves of new customers eager to support her. As Helen handed the cappuccinos and cake to the woman, she heard the familiar chime of the front door. She looked up to see Peter, her old friend, stepping inside. He was dressed casually, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and he carried a small bouquet of sunflowers. The sight of him brought an instant smile to her face. "Special delivery," Peter said, holding out the flowers. Helen wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the bouquet, inhaling their sweet, earthy scent. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he said, grinning, "but I figured you could use a little sunshine." She placed the flowers in a vase behind the counter. "Thank you. Let me get you a coffee." "On the house." "Only if I get one of those cinnamon rolls too," he said, pointing to the tray of warm pastries. "Deal." Helen prepared his order and brought it to a table by the window, joining him for a brief moment of quiet amid the morning rush. "How's everything going here?" Peter asked, biting into the cinnamon roll. "Busy, but good," Helen replied, sipping her coffee. "Sometimes it feels surreal, like I'm living someone else's life." He chuckled. "You worked hard for this, Helen. Don't downplay it." "I'm not," she said softly. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if it's all going to disappear as quickly as it came." Peter leaned forward, his expression serious. "It won't. You built this from the ground up. No one can take that away from you." Helen nodded. his words settling in her chest like a reassuring weight. "I'm trying to believe that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the flow of customers come and go. Peter had been a constant presence in her life since she reconnected with him. His encouragement had been a lifeline during the early days when she doubted herself, and his friendship had blossomed into something deeper, though neither of them had pushed it beyond the bounds of companionship. For now, that was enough. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delivery driver carrying several large boxes of supplies. Helen excused herself to help with the inventory, leaving Peter to finish his coffee. As she moved through the storeroom, unpacking bags of flour and containers of sugar, her mind buzzed with ideas for expansion. The bakery was thriving, but she knew there was potential for more. By the afternoon, the cafe was still bustling. A group of college students occupied the corner table, sharing plates of pastries while discussing an upcoming project. An elderly couple sat by the window, splitting a chocolate croissant and holding hands as if they were still newlyweds. Helen loved watching these small moments unfold in her bakery. It reminded her of the community she had built, the home she had created not just for herself but for others. As she wiped down the counter, the door opened again, and a familiar face walked in. Ethan, her 10-year-old son, carrying his backpack and wearing his school uniform. His cheeks were flushed from the cool breeze outside, and his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Hey, Mom," he called out, waving as he made his way to the counter. "Hey, sweetheart, how was school?" "Good. We had a science experiment today, and it was awesome. We made volcanoes with baking soda and vinegar." Helen laughed, imagining the classroom chaos that experiment must have caused. "That sounds fun. Want a snack? Can I have a chocolate chip cookie?" "Of course." She grabbed one from the display case and handed it to him. "Go sit in the back and do your homework. I'll join you when I'm done." As Ethan settled into a booth, Helen felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This was the life she had fought for. A life where her son could grow up surrounded by stability and love, where she could show him that resilience wasn't just about surviving but thriving. Later that evening, after the bakery had closed and the last customer had left, Helen and Ethan sat in the kitchen, sharing a quiet dinner of homemade soup and fresh bread. The air was warm with the scent of herbs and garlic, and the dim lighting created a cozy ambience. "Mom," Ethan said, dipping his bread into the soup, "do you think Dad knows about the bakery?" Helen paused, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't given much thought to David lately. Her focus had been on building her business and creating a new life for herself and Ethan. But she knew it was only a matter of time before word reached him, if it hadn't already. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged. "I was just thinking. Maybe he'd be proud of you." The words stung in a way Helen hadn't expected. She didn't need David's pride or approval, but the fact that Ethan still cared about his father's opinion reminded her of the complicated emotions tied to their past. "I'm proud of me," she said, giving Ethan a reassuring smile. "And that's what matters." He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer, and they returned to their meal. After dinner, Helen tucked Ethan into bed, reading him a chapter from his favorite book before turning out the lights. As she closed his door and returned to the living room, her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from a local event planner, requesting a meeting to discuss a large catering order for an upcoming gala. Helen's heart raced as she read the details. This could be a game changer, a chance to showcase her bakery to some of the city's most influential people. She replied to the email, setting up a meeting for the following week. As she closed her laptop, she allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the challenges ahead. Helen walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The glow of the streetlights reflected off the pavement, and she could see her bakery's sign illuminated in the night. She had come so far, but she wasn't done yet. There were bigger dreams to chase, and this time, she knew she had what it took to make them a reality. David Harper sat in his dimly lit office, the heavy scent of leather, paper, and stale whiskey lingering in the air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city twinkled like a promise he could no longer keep. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the financial reports displayed on his laptop. Every graph and chart painted the same bleak picture: Decline. He closed the laptop, leaned back in his chair, and rubbed his temples. The noise in his head had become a constant hum, a mixture of fear, regret, and something darker, something he didn't want to name. He had fought so hard to build this empire, sacrificing relationships, time, and even his own happiness to ensure that his name would be synonymous with success. And yet, here he was, on the verge of losing everything. The knock on his office door was soft but insistent. He didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the door creaked open anyway, and Sophia stepped inside. Her designer heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked toward him, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "You've been in here all day," she said, her voice softer than usual but laced with impatience. "You missed the charity dinner." David didn't look up. "I wasn't in the mood," Sophia sighed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the desk. "David, this can't keep happening. You can't shut down every time things get tough." He finally met her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't expected: disappointment. Sophia had always been the carefree one, the woman who laughed at his jokes and indulged his whims. But now, that laughter was gone, replaced by the reality of a life she hadn't signed up for. "I'm handling it," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "No, you're not," she replied. "The company is falling apart, and so are you. And you're dragging me down with you." Her words cut deeper than he expected. "I didn't force you to stay." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I stayed because I believed in you. But now, I don't know who you are anymore." David stood abruptly, knocking over the empty whiskey glass on his desk. "You think I don't know how bad things are? You think I don't feel it every second of every day? Then do something about it," she said, her voice rising. "Because I can't keep waiting for you to fix this." The room fell silent, the weight of her ultimatum hanging between them. Sophia exhaled sharply, grabbed her purse, and headed for the door. "I'm staying at my sister's for a while. Figure out what you want, David." The door closed behind her, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence. He collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. Sophia's departure felt like the final nail in the coffin. He had lost her the same way he had lost everything else, with neglect, pride, and an inability to admit he needed help. By the next morning, the headlines were brutal. Harper Industries faces potential bankruptcy as stocks plummet. The media vultures circled, eager to pick apart his failures. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, lawyers, and investors, all demanding answers he didn't have. He ignored most of the calls, but one from Richard, his CFO, forced him to pick up. "We need to talk," Richard said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The board is holding an emergency meeting this afternoon." David clenched his jaw. "I know. I'll be there." "You don't have much time," Richard warned. "If you don't present a solid recovery plan, they'll push for your resignation." David hung up without responding. The idea of stepping down was unthinkable. He had built Harper Industries from nothing, transforming it into one of the most powerful conglomerates in the city. But now, it seemed the empire he had spent years constructing was slipping through his fingers, brick by brick. The meeting was held in the same boardroom where he had once commanded the room with confidence. Today, the atmosphere was different. The executives avoided his gaze, their expressions ranging from concern to thinly veiled contempt. Richard sat at the far end of the table, flipping through a stack of documents. David cleared his throat and began his presentation, outlining a series of cost-cutting measures and strategic shifts intended to stabilize the company. But as he spoke, he could see the doubt etched into their faces. They didn't believe him. And, if he were honest with himself, he wasn't sure he believed it either. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before Richard spoke. "Thank you, David. The board will consider your proposal and reconvene tomorrow." It was a dismissal, one that stung more than he cared to admit. As he left the building, the cool evening air hit him like a slap. He walked aimlessly through the city, the sounds of honking cars and bustling pedestrians fading into the background. He passed luxury boutiques and five-star restaurants, places he had once frequented without a second thought. But tonight, they felt like remnants of a life that no longer belonged to him. He found himself standing outside a familiar cafe, one he hadn't visited since before the divorce. The sight of it brought back memories of long, lazy mornings with Helen, sharing coffee and pastries while they planned their future. He wondered if she ever thought about those mornings, or if she had buried them along with the rest of their marriage. Curiosity, or perhaps desperation, compelled him to check his phone. He searched for her name and found a recent news article about Sweet Revival's expansion. The bakery was thriving, with plans to open a second location downtown. The article described Helen as a beacon of resilience, someone who had turned adversity into opportunity. He stared at her photo, his throat tightening. She looked radiant, her eyes filled with the kind of determination he hadn't seen in years. She had rebuilt her life while his was falling apart. A sudden urge to see her overtook him, and before he could overthink it, he dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, before her voice, steady and composed, answered. David. The sound of her name on his lips felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. Helen, what do you want? She asked, cutting him off. He swallowed hard, the weight of his failure pressing against his chest. I need to see you. It's important. There was a pause, and for a moment, he thought she might hang up. But then she sighed. Fine. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. at the cafe on 5th. The line went dead, leaving him standing on the sidewalk with a phone in his hand and a knot in his stomach. Tomorrow would be his chance to ask for help, but it would also be a reckoning, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As he walked back to his apartment, the reality of his situation became painfully clear. He had spent years chasing power, status, and wealth, only to end up here, alone, humbled, and searching for salvation in the woman he had once discarded. Tomorrow, he would have to confront not just Helen, but the version of himself he had tried so hard to ignore. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as Helen Harper sat by the window of the cozy cafe on 5th Avenue. The morning rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving droplets clinging to the glass like tiny prisms that refracted the soft light of the overcast sky. She stirred her cappuccino absent-mindedly, the foam swirling in delicate patterns as she watched pedestrians hurry past on the slick sidewalk. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, a nervous habit she hadn't indulged in for years. She wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting. When David had called her, his voice strained and unfamiliar, she had almost ignored it. But curiosity, or maybe some lingering desire for closure, had compelled her to say yes. Now, as she sat waiting for him, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Helen instinctively looked up. David entered, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his once pristine suit slightly rumpled. He looked thinner than she remembered, as though the weight of his failures had carved away at him. His eyes, once sharp and filled with ambition, were clouded with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or exhaustion. He spotted her and hesitated, standing awkwardly near the entrance before making his way to her table. Helen remained seated, her posture composed but her fingers tightening around the cup. Hi, Helen, he said, his voice softer than she remembered. David, she replied, gesturing for him to sit. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, running a hand through his disheveled hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, weighted with memories and unspoken grievances. You look well, he said finally, breaking the tension. Helen raised an eyebrow, unsure if it was meant as a compliment or a veiled attempt to ease his way into the conversation. I am well. And you? David hesitated, then shook his head. Not really, she nodded, appreciating the honesty but unwilling to offer sympathy just yet. I figured. You wouldn't have called me otherwise. He exhaled, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, not after everything I did. But I'm running out of options. Helen tilted her head, her expression unreadable. What exactly do you want from me, David? He met her gaze, his vulnerability laid bare in a way that made her uncomfortable. The company is on the verge of collapse. I've made bad decisions, too many to count, and now I'm paying the price. I need a loan to stabilize things, just enough to buy some time while I restructure. She set her cup down carefully, her eyes never leaving his. Why me? David swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Because you're the only person I trust to give me an honest chance. Helen let out a short, bitter laugh. You trust me now? That's ironic, considering how little you trusted me when we were married. I know, he said quickly, his voice cracking. I know I let you down. I made you feel small, like you weren't enough. But you were, Helen. You always were. I just couldn't see it then. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, but she forced herself to stay grounded. She had spent too many nights replaying their past, wondering what she could have done differently to save their marriage. But those days were behind her now, and she refused to let his words drag her back. You're right, she said, her tone cool. I was enough, and I'm still enough. Without you. David flinched, but he nodded as if he had expected the response. I deserve that. Helen leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. You do, but I'm not here to rehash the past. You came to me for help, so let's talk business. He straightened slightly, sensing a sliver of opportunity. I need a short-term loan to cover immediate expenses and payroll. In return, I'm willing to offer equity in the company. Helen considered his offer, her mind racing through the possibilities. She could help him, but at what cost? Was this a chance to prove to herself and to him that she had risen above their shared history? Or was it a trap, one that would pull her back into the web of his chaos? What's your plan for recovery? She asked, her tone firm. David hesitated, then pulled out a folder from his briefcase and handed it to her. This outlines the steps I'm taking. Selling off non-essential assets, renegotiating contracts, and downsizing departments that aren't profitable. Helen flipped through the documents, her critical eye scanning the numbers and projections. He had put effort into the plan, but there were gaps, areas where his optimism outweighed the reality of the situation. Still, there was potential if executed properly. I see the flaws, she said, tapping a page with her finger. This isn't going to work unless you cut deeper and faster. The longer you hold on to underperforming assets, the more they'll drain you. David nodded, absorbing her feedback without argument. I'm willing to make the necessary changes. She closed the folder and met his gaze. If I agree to this loan, it won't be out of pity. I'm a businesswoman now, and I expect to be treated as one. Of course, he said quickly. I wouldn't expect anything less. And I'll have conditions, she continued. I want a seat on the board, full access to financial reports, and veto power on any major decisions until the loan is repaid. David's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Done. Helen leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. One more thing. This isn't personal, David. I'm doing this because it makes sense for my business. Don't confuse my help for forgiveness. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch. I understand. They sat in silence for a moment, the rain outside tapping gently against the window. Helen felt a mix of emotions, relief, power, and a lingering sadness for the man who had once been her partner but was now a stranger seeking redemption. She reached for her cappuccino, taking a slow sip before speaking again. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork. If you agree to the terms, we can move forward. David exhaled, the tension visibly draining from his body. Thank you, Helen. You don't know what this means to me. I know exactly what it means, she said, her voice steady. But don't mistake this for anything other than what it is, a business transaction. Once you've repaid the loan, we're done. He nodded, accepting her terms. Understood. As they stood to leave, Helen pulled on her coat and watched as David lingered by the door, as if waiting for something unsaid. She didn't offer him anything more. Whatever he was searching for, her forgiveness, her approval, he wouldn't find it here. Good luck, David, she said, opening the door. He stepped out into the drizzle, his figure disappearing into the crowd. Helen remained by the doorway for a moment, watching the rain wash away the footprints on the pavement. When she finally turned away, she felt lighter, as though she had shed the last remnants of the past that had once held her down. David was no longer her problem. She had her own path to follow, and she wasn't looking back. The soft hum of the office air conditioning was the only sound accompanying David Harper as he sat alone in the conference room of Harper Industries. The blinds were half drawn, casting slanted shadows across the table and floor, and the late afternoon sun bled through the gaps, creating stripes of golden light that flickered each time the breeze outside shifted. The room, once a place of power, felt cavernous now. The large table, with its sleek, polished surface, seemed unnecessarily long, like an expanse he no longer had the authority to command. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and a cup of lukewarm coffee sat untouched at his elbow. The documents spread before him, financial projections, legal agreements, and restructuring plans, blurred together in a mess of ink and paper. His eyes skimmed them, but nothing stuck. His mind was elsewhere. The loan agreement with Helen had gone through earlier that morning. Her lawyer had been meticulous, leaving no loopholes, no room for negotiation. The terms were airtight, and Helen had been just as clear in her expectations during their final conversation. She had helped him, but it wasn't a favor, it was business. And when the loan was repaid, that would be the end of their connection. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting across from him at the cafe, calm and resolute. As if their shared history had been filed away in a drawer she no longer felt the need to open. She had been kind in her own way, but not forgiving. He realized now that he had been hoping for some sign that she still cared, something that could offer him a path to redemption. But Helen had made it clear. She didn't need him. She had outgrown him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and Richard stepped in, carrying a folder thick with updated reports. "Got a minute?" the CFO asked. David gestured to the seat across from him. "Might as well." Richard sat down and slid the folder across the table. "These are the final figures after the asset sales and the initial influx of cash from Helen's loan. It'll buy us a few months, maybe more if we push the cost reductions harder." David opened the folder and scanned the numbers. They weren't great, but they were better than before. The company had a chance, small, but real. He knew it would take ruthless decisions to keep it afloat, and even then, there was no guarantee of success. "Payroll is covered through the next quarter," Richard continued. "We've shut down the underperforming divisions, and I've got a team renegotiating contracts with our suppliers." "It's not pretty, but it's progress," David nodded, closing the folder and tapping his fingers against its cover. "Thanks, Richard. I appreciate the update." Richard hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "I heard about the loan," he said carefully. "From Helen." David's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain composed. "It's a temporary solution." "I hope so," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "But I've known you a long time, David. I can see this is eating at you." David exhaled slowly, his fingers clenching and unclenching on the edge of the table. "I didn't think it would be this hard," he admitted. "I thought I could fix everything like I always have." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You were always good at making things happen, but this isn't the same as before. You're not the same either." Those words lingered in the air long after Richard left the room. David stared out the window, watching the city move on without him. People walked along the sidewalks, cars honked, and businesses thrived. Life was continuing, indifferent to his struggles. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had spent so much of his life trying to outrun failure that he had never considered what it would feel like to face it head-on. He gathered his things and left the office, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. As he stepped outside, the crisp evening air greeted him, cooling the sweat that had gathered at the base of his neck. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the skyscrapers. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go. On impulse, he hailed a cab and gave the driver an address that felt both familiar and foreign. It wasn't until the cab pulled up to the street that he realized he had come to the house he and Helen had once shared. The sight of it, with its white brick facade and neatly trimmed hedges, sent a wave of nostalgia crashing over him. He hadn't been back since the divorce. David paid the driver and stepped out, standing on the sidewalk as he studied the house. A part of him had expected it to look different, but it was exactly the same, except for the absence of Helen's car in the driveway. He walked up the path and hesitated before knocking on the front door. A few moments later, the door opened and Ethan stood there, his eyes widening in surprise. He had grown taller, his features sharper, but the boyishness was still there, lingering in his curious expression. "Dad." David's throat tightened. "Hey, buddy." Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The familiar scent of lemon cleaner and freshly baked cookies filled the air, reminding David of the countless evenings they had spent as a family in this house. He followed Ethan to the living room, where the boy plopped down on the couch, his homework spread across the coffee table. "Is Mom home?" David asked, glancing around. "No, she's still at the bakery," Ethan replied, flipping through his notebook. "She's been working late a lot." David sat on the armchair, watching his son with a mixture of pride and guilt. "How's school?" "Good. I got an A on my science project," Ethan said, a hint of pride in his voice. "That's great," David said, smiling despite the ache in his chest. "I'm proud of you." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only existed between family members who didn't need to fill every moment with words. For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of calm. But it was short-lived. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted him back to reality. He stood as the front door opened and Helen walked in, her arms full of grocery bags. She froze when she saw him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone cautious but not hostile. "I just wanted to see Ethan," David said, his voice low. Helen set the bags down on the kitchen counter and crossed her arms. "You've seen him. Now what?" David looked at her, taking in the strength she exuded. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was someone stronger, someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. "I wanted to say thank you for the loan." Helen nodded but didn't soften. "Like I said, it's business. Don't read more into it." "I know," he said quietly, "but I also wanted you to know that I see it now. Everything I took for granted. You were right to let me go." She studied him for a moment, then sighed. "I didn't let you go, David. You let me go." Her words hit him like a blow, but he didn't flinch. He had come to accept that truth, painful as it was. After a few moments of silence, Helen walked over to Ethan and kissed his forehead. "Time to get ready for bed," she said softly. Ethan nodded and headed upstairs, leaving them alone in the living room. David turned to leave, but before he stepped outside, he looked back at Helen. "I hope someday you can forgive me." She didn't answer right away, her gaze steady and unyielding. Finally, she said, "I already forgave myself." "That's enough." As the door closed behind him, David walked into the night, unsure of what the future held but knowing that, for the first time, he couldn't run from himself anymore.